Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. John Suzuki is the author of American Grit, a book he never expected to write. John is a Japanese American. He was working for a technology company. He had a young family. He was focused on work. But for weeks, everywhere John went, he saw notices about a get-together at Minidoka, one of 10 Japanese internment camps from World War II. He didn't know anything about the camp or its history. But something told him he had to attend. He got the last reservation for the meeting, and he boarded a bus to the camp. Nothing in particular struck him about the meeting until, on the last day, John saw a sign with the names of 1,000 Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight for their country in World War II, even though their families had been stripped of their assets and were interned in concentration camps across the U.S. And in that list of names, he discovered the story of Shiro Kashino, known as Cash. American Grit is Cash's story, and it's a story for all of us. Please welcome John Suzuki to Bump in the Road. John, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Yeah. Hey, Pat. Thank you. I can't tell you how happy I am and honored I am to be here. I think about your podcast and your audience. I've had a lot of bumps in the road. I'm just like everybody, all of your audience members out there. But I'm 62 years old. I've recently retired, if you will, from a career in technology with companies like IBM and Sun Microsystems and Expedia. We all have bumps in the road, career bumps. I think one of my biggest bumps in the road was when I was 15 years old and I lost my best friend to suicide. And, I love your podcast because, you share experiences that people have. And perhaps there's experiences out there that are being shared that folks out there can relate to. And so, my life has been one of, personally, I believe that we all have three careers in our lives. The first is to learn and go to school. The second is to earn a living for your life, for yourself and your family. And the third is to return and to give back. And kind of in 30-year segments, but, they all overlap, but that's just philosophically how I feel. And so I've entered my third career of giving back. And because as tough as life has been, I'm still here. And I hope that I can spend a lot of years giving back and helping people.
Well, I think you give back enormously in your book. I really want to talk about that. It's called American Grit. Give us an overview of what the book is about.
Yeah. So the overview, when people hear the words American Grit, most people don't think of a bunch of Americans of Japanese ancestry, but back in 2008, I came across a flyer. And this flyer talked about this pilgrimage to a place called Minidoka. Well, I didn't know what a pilgrimage was, and I didn't know what a Minidoka was. So I just blew it off. It was happening 2 months later. Well, over the subsequent 2 months, that flyer showed up everywhere. And finally, the day before this pilgrimage was supposed to happen, it showed up on my windshield. And I just said, okay, all right, I get it. I'll make a phone call. So I called him up and I said, hey, listen, I know it's tomorrow, but do you have any space? And the woman on the other side said, my gosh, this must be your lucky day. I just had a cancellation. So the next day I'm on this bus a 12-hour bus ride from Seattle to Twin Falls, Idaho. And at that time, I had a job that had me traveling 3 weeks out of the month. Had 2 kids young kids I was raising. I didn't have time to take 3 days out of my life for something I had no clue about. And so on this bus ride, everybody talked about why they were going. And when they finally came to me, I told everybody, I have no clue why I'm here. I have no clue why I'm here. And I said, but I have a feeling that I'll have a pretty good idea why I'm here on the bus ride home. So first and second day that we were there, nothing happened. But on the third day, I discovered this billboard. And by the way, we're at the former concentration camp called Minidoka. And we were talking to people who were survivors, who were children at the time. And I come across this billboard in this former concentration camp called the Honor Roll that listed the names of 1,000 men, 1,000 Japanese American men who volunteered out of that concentration camp to fight and in some cases die for the United States Army. And it was the United States Army that put them and their families in that camp to begin with. And these guys were volunteering to go off to war while their families were still imprisoned in that camp by the United States Army. And it was a story. I mean, I had no idea that this happened. And I was stunned. It was, who would do such a thing, right? Who would volunteer for the United States Army given those circumstances? And so it was then that I realized that I had to write a book and potentially a movie to tell this story to everybody. And that's how the story of American Grit all started. It became a calling that I couldn't ignore.
Well, how did you start? Did you call the 1,000 people listed on the list? I mean, what was the point where you started to focus on Cash and his journey?
Yeah, so there was a little company at the time back in 2008 called Google. And there's also things called the Yellow Pages. And so what happened was I knew about 2 major battles that these men of Japanese ancestry, Americans, had fought during World War II in France and Italy. One was called the Battle of the Lost Battalion, and the other one was called the Battle of the Gothic Line. And these were 2 of the most epic battles in the history of the United States military. And I knew that this group of men, which was part of who was part of a Japanese American segregated war unit in World War II. It was a war unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was made up of all Japanese Americans. And they went on to become the most decorated war unit in the history of the United States for its size and duration. And so I knew about them. I knew about these battles. So I searched for a man who came out of Minidoka, who volunteered out of Minidoka and fought in the 2 battles. And I came across this man called Shiro Kishino. And so then my hunt for finding Shiro Kishino, started. And I found a few weeks later that he had passed away in 1997. But his was a story I wanted to tell. So I wanted to meet his widow, Louise Kishino. So I sent out registered letters to every Kishino I could find on the West Coast. And nobody responded, obviously. And I sent them out again. And eventually, somehow my letter got to Shiro Kishino's widow. And she called me up, which was a day I will never forget. And we got together and collaborated on this book. And she was a legal secretary by profession. And so she had everything, contacts, news articles, letters that Shiro had written to her while he was at war. And so, it's been an amazing journey.
I want to backtrack just a little bit. Talk about the concentration camps and What and how people were just corralled into these things, how horrible they were. I don't think people really realize what a terrible piece of American history this is.
Oh, it's super terrible, super terrible. So after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear of the Japanese attacking the West Coast. And so there was one of the prevalent feelings on the West Coast and in the United States was that if they look like the enemy, they must be the enemy. And so President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the United States Army to basically evacuate, all round up everybody who was at least 1/16 of Japanese ancestry, round them all up off the West Coast and put them in these 10 concentration camps scattered across the United States. And these concentration camps were in the worst places in this country. They were in the deserts and swamps of America where nobody lived. And they built these camps, and these camps were surrounded by barbed wire, had armed American soldiers guarding them. And their facilities were made out of lumber and tar paper. And so there was no plumbing. When they got there, the bathrooms were just basically holes in the ground, and they were left to their own devices behind barbed wire. And somebody had reported that these camps were for their own protection. And I remember reading one of the inmates saying, if these are for our protection, why are the guns pointed at us? And so they had to, and these were places where the temperatures in the summer got up above 100 and 105 degrees, where the temperatures in the winter got down below zero, in these terrible, terrible circumstances. Oh, and by the way, you had mentioned that they lost everything. The only thing they could keep was what they could carry. And how do you know what to take when you don't know where you're going? You don't know for how long you're going to go for. And you got to remember, these people, when they were told that they were going to be taken away, had the only reference that they had was a reference to the camps in Nazi Germany of the Holocaust, where the Jews and their definition of bad people were being rounded up. And so it was a really scary time because nobody told them what was going to happen to them. A lot of them thought that they were just going to be taken out to the desert and shot. And so they didn't know when they were going to come home. They didn't know if they were going to be in prison forever. And so those were the circumstances that they were in. And it was terrible. It was terrible. So they eventually, the really cool thing was that they all came together, and they created their own schools, and they created their own hospitals. The people who were doctors in the camps. People who were cooks in the camps. People who were teachers became teachers in the camps, and they created their own communities and supported each other, and that's how they survived. But it was really, really terrible. It was really terrible. It was, and I just want to tell you this one thing. I mentioned about these men who volunteered out of these camps, out of these terrible circumstances, to fight, to prove their loyalty to the United States and to prove that they deserved to be Americans just as much as anybody else did. And the irony of this is that here we were fighting a war for freedom and democracy around the world. And we were throwing our own citizens in these concentration camps because of their race and no other reason. And these guys went off to fight for that when they themselves and their families were. Anyway, it was really crazy.
How did Cash navigate this set of circumstances?
It's really amazing what he did, and in a lot of ways, super, super inspiring. He found himself Well, before the war started, there was a lot of prejudice and racism against Japanese people. And so he had to deal with that. But next thing you know, he finds himself in this concentration camp behind barbed wire, looking on the other side of the barbed wire at his freedom. And, he decided instead of cowering and feeling sorry for himself, he decided to do something about it. And he decided that he was going to do whatever he had to do to prove that Japanese Americans could be loyal Americans as much as anybody else. And so what he found was what I call a program. And the program that he found was called the United States Army. And so he volunteered for the Army. And he decided to use that as a way to make sure that he and all these other 120,000 people didn't spend the rest of their lives in these camps, and wanted to do what he could to prove that they deserve rights as Americans, just as all Americans do.
He went off to Europe to fight.
He did.
What did he find over in Europe?
Well, he found a war. he found a lot of death. He found a lot of misery, and he found the enemy. And what he did. Cash came. Shiro Kishino's nickname was Cash, and I'll just go to the whole punchline of his military career. He left his military career with a Silver Star, 6 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, as one of the most decorated soldiers of World War II. And he led his men. And I had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing a number of his men. And all of them told me the same thing. They said that he was a man that they never were afraid to follow into battle. And he always went first. He always did the hard stuff first, because he was actually orphaned as a child, and he didn't have parents. And so the one thing that he wanted to make sure he did was to get his men back to his parents. And so he always took the most dangerous assignments because he figured that he was more expendable than any of his men, because he didn't have parents whose hearts would be broken if he died. And so, but he led his men, and he got either shot or blown up 6 times. And these are 6 separate times, right? I mean, it's not 5. You got 5 bullets at the same time. If you got shot 3 or 4 times, that's 1 Purple Heart at that one time, right? He got 6 Purple Hearts. And so he was just one of his men who became a Medal of Honor recipient, Barney Hajiro. He described Cash as a soldier's soldier. And he told me that, and he told everybody who would listen to him, that Cash deserved the Medal of Honor more than he did. And so he led all of his men, wanting to make sure they survived, and with not much disregard for his own life. And so just one little thing, whenever he would get injured, or whenever he'd get shot or whatever, he'd go to the field hospital, and before they could stop him, he would get patched up and leave and go back to his men to fight again. And so he did that 5 times. He would get injured, and then he would get patched up, and he'd take off before anybody could stop him. So kind of crazy. If I got shot, and I'd hazard a guess that if anybody listening to this podcast got shot, oh my gosh, we would call 911. We'd go to the hospital, and we'd stay in the hospital for as long as we possibly could. No, Cash didn't do that. He kept going back, and he kept getting injured again over and over and over again. But that's the kind of guy he was.
Later, he was stripped of his rank and I believe his awards too, wasn't he?
No, not of his awards.
Okay.
So he was stripped. He was accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and he was court-martialed for a crime he didn't commit. And he lived with that court-martial until he died. With that court-martial, he also lost his rank. But just before he died, it was a 10-year effort before he died. Louise, his wife, decided to fight it. And this was 40 years later, after all statutes of limitations had passed. And but they decided to try to rectify it. So, make a long story short, they were successful in getting his rank of staff sergeant reinstated, because when he was court-martialed, he lost his rank and was demoted back down to a buck private. But they restored his rank, and then shortly after he died, the Judge Advocate General actually overturned his court-martial, which was and cleared his name, which was what he really wanted. But he lived his whole life with the stigma of that court-martial. Never the victim, never begrudged the United States Army or the United States government. He was always thankful that he came home alive from the war, and that's how he lived his life. And for me, kind of a superhero story. And it's a story that I wanted to get out there to share with people, so they could, hopefully to inspire folks, to let folks know that, it's okay to be a victim. It's okay to bad things bumps in the road happen all the time. Right. And one thing I can promise everybody is that a bump in the road is in your future. Lots of bumps in our roads are in our future. The question is, how are you going to respond to those bumps in the road? Right. Are you going to do nothing and be the victim, or are you going to respond to it, learn from them, and try to make things better based on the experiences that you have? And Cash was one guy, and Louise was another person, and all these people who survived from the camps had massive bumps in the road, and they responded in a way that made things better for everybody.
What do you think are some of the major learning lessons that come out of this story?
Tomorrow will come. Tomorrow will come. These folks in these camps had no hope. They had no hope. They had no reason for hope. And if anybody had reason to roll up in a ball and cry themselves to sleep, it was these folks, right? And feel sorry for themselves. And for me, the biggest lesson is, bad things are going to happen. They can happen again. Another reason for my writing this book is to do my part to make sure that their experiences are never forgotten, and that concentration camps in America and ideally eventually all over the world never happen again. And people ask me all the time, John, do you really think concentration camps can happen in America again? And I say, absolutely. And I refer back not too long ago to 9/11, right? Back in 9/11, somebody came up with a misguided idea that all Muslims were terrorists and needed to be rounded up and put away. And I'm really proud to say that a lot of the Japanese community, the Japanese American community, rose up and said, no, that ain't going to happen. A story that a lot of people don't know about was that President Bush's transportation secretary at the time was a guy named Norman Mineta. And Norman Mineta lived in a concentration camp during World War II. And so President Bush said to his national security, everybody he talked to, right? He told me, he says, whatever solutions you guys come up with to address this attack will not include rounding up people and putting them in camps like we did to this guy, And so it was really great that President Bush at the time had that as a reference and made sure that wasn't going to happen again. But can they happen again? Absolutely. We can end up with a president who just makes a bad decision, right? Based on the information that he has and the advisors that are advising him. Can they happen? Absolutely. They happen once, they can happen again. And I want to get in front of this so we can make sure it doesn't.
Well, I think all these sorts of decisions are all fear-driven. And I think we also saw it during COVID. Many people were recommending camps during COVID.
Absolutely.
So this is not exactly ancient history. And the solution doesn't lie in the situation. It lies in dealing with the fear, trying to unravel it, and trying to find, I think, commonalities rather than differences.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and that's part of my fear, my personal fear is that we are a society right now that's what I call bucketizing people. Okay. I mean, we got the whites buckets and we got the blacks buckets and we got the Christians buckets and the Muslim buckets and the gay bucket. I mean, we have all these, we have white Christian, and it's crazy. I mean, we're categorizing people instead of bringing people together and coming together, right? We're categorizing it, and it's the categorization of people combined with fear, combined with something really, really bad happening called World War II. Mm-hmm. That led to the concentration camps to begin with. And so, I mean, right now we live in so much fear and frankly, a lot of blame, lots of blame, right? Everybody's got somebody to blame for whatever's happening in the world, right? We're seeing the same recipe for success. And so my hope is to, maybe take a little bit of that fear and redirect some of that energy to a little bit more love and helping people and understanding people, and taking a little bit of that blaming phenomena and redirecting some of that energy to taking responsibility, for some of the things that are going on. And I think that if we can do that, and if we could do that I believe that, lifting an individual lifts the world. And so, if we could just do that just a little bit, right? I think we can move mountains, and we need to right now. And so my hope is that I want to be part of a renaissance of moving back and back towards the direction of love, and a little bit farther away from fear.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.